It's lovely to see such a big crowd on a Saturday afternoon. Thank you very much for coming and joining us. I'm going to presume you've all seen the show down on the third floor, and if you haven't had a chance to see it, then obviously following our conversation here, you can visit the work or revisit the work indeed, hopefully with fresh eyes, depending on the amazing insights that we're about to get. It's lovely to have Hal here with us, and obviously to stage this work. This is a major acquisition for GoMA, but also just it's an absolute delight to see this work on show. There are 4 major bits of work downstairs, I guess we could say. And what we'll do is we'll talk through those, but focus in particular on key sets. And I think it's probably best if we start by talking about Gay Semiotics, which is the first set of works that you see as you're entering the space downstairs, but probably is still the piece of work that you're best known for as a photographer. You moved to San Francisco in 1975, and you were moving there for study, right? For graduate study.
Yes.
And you started taking these pictures in February 1977, if I'm right. Could you say what the inspiration behind the series was? What it was that you were trying to do?
It is a series, but if I can remember correctly, it didn't really start as a series. It's something that really grew as it went along. And to backtrack a little bit, I had been doing things with writing on photographs and more of a manipulative type photography. So the idea of combining image and text and diagrams was not something new to my work. But I arrived in San Francisco at a point where there was sort of a new movement's almost too big a word, but actually all through California, a conceptual movement that was starting to impact how photography was looked at, and not through my formal studies, but actually through my work as an art writer, art critic. I met a man named Lou Thomas who really became a big influence, and the genesis of the work was really that he was doing with me what he did with many artists and giving them things to read and to think about. And it was a book called The Structure of Art by Jack Burnham. And it was talking about Claude Lévi-Strauss, the anthropologist, and his ideas about signifiers. And that was the basis for the first series of work. And things continued to grow out of that. I was on, I don't want to say I was on a deadline, but I was scheduled to have my first one-person exhibition later that year. And interestingly, the gallery had selected me based on my earlier work. But I think as I got into this, I then proposed that to them.
Yeah.
So that was the beginning of it.
Yeah. Could you say a little bit more about the Lévi-Strauss influence? You've also said in an interview that there was a little bit of Roland Barthes in there, but yeah. I'm interested in that. If you could say a little bit more about that structuralist, semiotic influence on the project as a whole.
I don't like to overdo that because I'm not good at reading theory. I mean, I'm one of these people that likes, I'll read something, oh, I got it, I'm gonna use it, and then I stop. I don't sit around and read theory for entertainment. I mean, it's just, there are people that do, by the way, but I'm not one of them. So, but I don't know, my writing certainly was influenced by Roland Barthes, but I don't know that I can say that what really influenced the photography, and to put all of this in another way, my mentor, I think what he talked about with photography, trying to remove the emotionalism from photography. That's actually his word. I think that for us, it was talking about moving away from what was this very strong tradition of fine art photography on the West Coast that was very much based in Ansel Adams and in nature and a certain kind of mystical thinking. I mean, very, very sloppy, to say the least. So the fact that we were being introduced to people and to writers, and I think that really, for me, the best analogy is when Susan Sontag wrote the essay Against Interpretation. that I think a lot of those ideas which came out of French philosophy and French thinking and were being applied more to literature, that this was an identical thing going on sort of a decade later with photography, that it came up. But I'm always hesitant, like, well, are you a structuralist? Well, just even try defining structuralism, because it starts in one place with Claude Levi-Strauss and then goes about 20 other places. So I don't even like to get into that kind of thing.
Yeah. We won't get into it too much, don't worry, that's fine. I wonder though if you could say a bit about what you were attempting to do with the full kind of collection that makes up that body. So there's 24 images that are in there. They're in bits, aren't they? They're in smaller subsections within that collection.
Yes.
I mean, you were attempting to kind of capture a particular moment, maybe, and in particular to register kind of visual signifiers that were being used at the time.
I think all that's true, but I think that that my work is from that period is very, very celebratory, and it's also about me looking at the culture that I lived in and making it accessible to others. And that's kind of a thing with me that sort of has gone through my entire working career, about the more complex something is, the more I want to break it down and make it accessible to others. And I think that, as a whole, totality of the work reflects just the sense of both of openness that I felt in San Francisco, and that you could actually do this. I never thought of this as documentary work, because documentary and photography had very specific connotations, and I definitely was in the fine art photography camp. And this was still at a time where, actually, believe it or not, there were still arguments about if photography was art. And it was still, like in art magazines and things, if it was even in there, was being segregated into its own section and things. So, as a medium, it exists sort of over a little bit to the left of painting and sculpture, and you have fine art photography, but then you had journalism, you had fashion photography, you had all these other things. So I remember one of my friends, a very, very good, well-known photographer, getting totally irate because Richard Avedon was given a great big show at the Art Museum in Berkeley, and it was like, well, that's fashion photography, it's not art. And of course now I walk into recently a show at the Getty in Los Angeles, and there's Avedon's work that he did in fashion in Paris, up on the walls, and it's art. So photography has always had this kind of fluidity, but particularly in California, I think that it really developed as a fine art because you didn't have the fashion industry, you don't have photojournalism, you don't have all these other things.
What was it particularly about the combination of words and images that appealed to you? What was it that, where had that come from with you, but also why was that key for this particular series?
I don't know where it came from originally, but as I said, it was something I'd been doing for a really long time, and I think it was something that I did initially on a much more emotional basis, in that I would have an image and I want to write on it, but it was a very kind of subconscious process by what went with that image, and often it was deliberately ambiguous or mysterious or the relationship unclear. And so the two big changes with the Gay Semiotics work is, one, I was no longer manipulating images, and I'd gone back and forth. I'd done very unmanipulated photography and manipulated, but in this case that I went back, and I think that in the juxtaposition of the words and images, there's a strategy that I was using, which was to create images that were definitely have some references to mass media, but have a kind of deliberate banality built into them. The pictures have an extended grayscale as compared to traditional West Coast photography with these deep blacks in the zone system and a lot of mumbo jumbo about printing and lighting and everything. And I was going for something that was just on the face of it, you know, kind of banal, unthreatening. But I think to your point specifically, and that there's no way the photographs alone would have been enough to communicate what I wanted to communicate. And so I developed a strategy. The images are made that you see them from a distance, and they're completely unthreatening. They just look like, oh yeah. And then people would come up and you have to get close to read the text, and you start reading the text, and then it's like, uh-oh. And then I sort of throw in a joke and make it very disarming. And analogous, well, it's a little bit earlier, this work is, for example, Robert Mapplethorpe's X portfolio, which is a very intense body of work in the S&M culture, which, you know, it's the toughest work he ever made, and it's interesting because it's also work that then he decided to not show later on, because I think he didn't, but it was very out there work, and I was doing the exact opposite. So it's kind of interesting because the very first review that was done of my work for Artform, the writer actually brought up Mapplethorpe, and as that we were on opposite sides of the coin, because I was doing things that was trying to bring people into this, and if anything, the X portfolio it would be like, I don't need to go there with this.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and I guess you're also on the opposite sides of the country, right?
Well, but turns out we were on the opposite sides of a lot of things. I did not know that they were there was two camps in New York, and so there was the Peter Hujar, David Wojnarowicz camp, and then there was the Mapplethorpe camp. And I definitely, looking back on this retrospectively, I was much more in the Peter Hujar, Wojnarowicz camp, because I did have problems with, and still do, with Mapplethorpe's work.
I wonder if you could say a little bit more about comedy, because one of the things that really struck me looking around the show when we were here for the opening is just how funny a lot of it is. And you can see people responding to the work and genuinely laughing at it. That actually runs throughout all of the exhibition here, all of the works that are on show. How important was it for you that the works were entertaining, that there was a sense of humor to them?
Well, comedy runs throughout my entire life. I mean, that's just, I tend to bring a certain Jewish humor to things. And often it's quite self-deprecating. But, you know, comedy is a portal and how to address difficult subjects. I saw a film a couple of years ago, a documentary that was made called The Last Laugh. And it had these great American comedians like Sarah Silverman, and what it was about was Holocaust humor. And how do you do Holocaust humor? And, you know, that's a pretty tough thing to do. And if you could do it, it can be absolutely hilarious, like the movie The Producers, you know, but if you miss, you're in deep shit. So I think, you know, to me, to see people laughing, and actually 40 years after, I think people are laughing more now than they did. I think then the humor was just something that eased people away from discomfort. But I think now it's at this whole other level. And I mean, I really enjoy when I see that. I mean, you know, I've done this work and, you know, I've kind of put it away, even though it was known through my Gay Semiotics book, but then to bring it out and see people really engaged with it. I mean, that's just really tremendous for me.
Yeah, lovely. So the work was staged in 77. And it became a book in 78.
Yes.
How important was it for you that it became a book? I mean, obviously that was offered to you as an option. It was Lou that.
Yeah, my mentor,
anyway.
I mean, one of the things that happened with this idea, which we loosely became this photography and language people, is that Lou started his own small press, and over a period of time published a book called Photography and Language, published my Gay Semiotics, a second book from me of my Castro Street piece and some other books. And so these ideas, you know, for want of another term, I'd say they're a conceptual or structuralist based photography, got disseminated really quite widely. I had the opportunity that after Lou saw my show, he said we should make this into a book. And of course, I had no idea how you make 24 photos into a book. But he did, and this really ended up keeping the work alive and very present in people's minds. It also, when you see the show, and if you know the book, will understand that one of the things in translation into a book is that we really lost we sacrificed some of my ideas about how I wanted people to read the images, because in a lot of instances, text was put on a facing page, and so this whole idea of my strategy of how you looked at something on a wall and how you saw the image from here in that all was gone. And that's why in the new book, the first thing I said when my printers wanted to do a book, I said, the format has to be large enough so that we can do the photos with the text on them, so it's readable.
Yeah. And obviously that relationship between the two has to be very carefully calibrated. And we see that, in fact, with all of the work downstairs, that even trying to work out how much space the text itself should take up in relation to the photographs with some of the other series is important for you. I've got what might seem like quite a boring question. Could you say something about the font?
Of course I could say something.
Good. I'm really struck by the fact that the font in Gay Semiotics is very different to the text that we get in the other pieces of work, but it gives it a certain register.
I think it's all sans serif, and it's all kind of in the Helvetica family.
Okay.
So do you really see it different?
Yeah, I think it seems a bit more personal. I think it seems like it's in.
Well, Gay Semiotics is handwritten.
Yeah.
And then there's press type. But if you look at the press type, that style, and press type, for those of you who are young and don't remember rotary dial phones or even know what they are, but press type, we'd get these sheets, and you'd buy like Helvetica 12 point, and you had to sit there with a pencil, and you rubbed on it, and it went onto the paper. And that's how I did that on the big prints, doing that on acetate. But a little more complicated answer to that question is I'm a Midwesterner, and I did my undergraduate at the University of Illinois. And actually, my formal major was graphic design, and it was an incredibly rigorous program. Chicago was I went downstate about 150 miles away, but was very much Bauhaus influenced because of the German refugees that had come to Chicago and the Illinois Institute of Technology and Mies van der Rohe. There was just a lot. So this kind of type and this sans serif and this trying to be very precise really comes out of that tradition, probably through my teachers and things, and just that became part of that mindset.
Yeah. One of the references that often comes up in relation to Gay Semiotics, a comparison point, is with the work of August Sander. And I wonder, particularly his People of the 20th Century series, I wonder if you could say a little bit about that comparison, the attempt to kind of build a cartography of people, if you like.
Well, Saunders was really starting in college, one of the photographers that I was absolutely most drawn to. And I think for two reasons. One, the idea that somebody would set out to photograph, or map the people of the 20th century, I just think is such a wild idea. But that's what he really set out to do. And also for me, when I photograph people, and it's because I sometimes still, it's with my phone, might take photographs, but even before this work, and the idea of somebody letting people assume their own own position, their own posture. And what I see in Saunders' work, because of the era he worked in the first half of the 20th century, is that people still had positions in life. You know, they had uniforms, they had a way of being. So whether he would photograph a baker or a carpenter or a wrestler or a soldier, they would assume a certain position that would be related to their class, their profession, whatever. And I found that really, fascinating when I looked at his pictures. So when you see the street fashion series, which is the series that's obviously directly related to those ideas, none of those people were costumed. That's what they wore, and their apparel generated the idea for me, and then I in turn, would take them to a place and let them assume the posture, or whatever.
Yeah. Obviously, a kind of a strand of your work, or one thing that you are commenting on, is the rhetoric of advertising. And that connects, I think, some of the images in Gay Semiotics with the billboard that we have in the second space downstairs. And I wonder if you could just say a little bit about your relationship to that rhetoric and your awareness of critiquing it or just subtly undermining it in terms of your photographs. You commented at one point, for instance, and I can't remember whether it was at dinner the other night, excuse me, we've been talking quite a lot.
Glad somebody can remember something.
Somebody will remember. We were talking about the fact that that some of the images, the prototypes, the gay prototypes in the Gay Semiotics series could be seen in the gay press at the time in the 70s. So it's almost that there was a recognition that some of these images were being used as the basis of advertising to a particular subcultural market.
Well, photographers, of that period were starting to look beyond, whether you're going to talk about Martha Rossler and Alan Sekula, or Larry Sultan and Mike Mandel, who did a book called Evidence that became very well known, going through all these government files and pulling these pictures of, really strange things. So there was definitely this looking beyond, and I had a strong interest in that, and it served what I was doing. Because again, it's something that creates this kind of familiarity and at least non-confrontational. I think that's what really happens with the billboard more than anything, because people would look at it and go, that pose, and and there's things around like this, but wait, he doesn't have any clothes on.
Yeah. But it says downstairs next to the work, but you've also commented on it yourself that billboard has completely shifted its meaning since the time that it was first made, and now would not cause a stir. Well, in fact, it didn't when it was shown in 2015.
No, we did the billboard outside in San Francisco in 2015 when I was having a show, and it was hilarious. I finally on the last day went over to the bus stop. I thought, let's just see if anybody, and so somebody was standing there and I go, what do you think that billboard is? He says, didn't even lose a beat. Oh, I think it's an advertisement for a new Will Ferrell movie. So I'm like, okay. There's the context in which it's created doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
At the time, though, it utterly puzzled people. And it was on TV that night that it went up. It was one of, I think, 8 billboards that went up, but mine was the one that they were like, what is this? And using ambiguity with a salesman and a phone number caused people to jump to all sorts of kinds of conclusions about what it was, and so they could get offended or whatever. So that was pretty amusing. Yeah.
I'm going to at this point just move the discussion on to the Castro Street series, actually. Obviously, these works are connected to each other thematically, but these works were made in '78, and we have them, the 24 images staged here around the third room downstairs. Obviously, there are 24 in that, as there are in Gay Semiotics. I'm always fascinated by the number 24, if only because it's the number of frames per second for cinema. There seems to be something quite cinematic about that series. I wonder if you could talk about your relationship to cinema.
Well, there is a relationship. I actually ended up becoming an independent studies major and did my coursework in photography and film.
Okay.
And I studied with, although there was not a formal film program at the University of Illinois, I studied with some really interesting people. Robert Carringer, who is now a patron of mine, and also, but he's the, I'm sure, foremost specialist on Citizen Kane in the world. And just got a really good understanding. I was pretty sure I wanted to be a filmmaker and made a couple films in college and actually applied and was accepted to the London Film School and came over and went to the school for one term. It doesn't exist anymore. It was a school created by Sir Carol Reed, so it was a very industry-based school, and it was really good because about after the second week I realized I didn't want to be a filmmaker, and I certainly didn't want to be the kind of filmmaking that they were training, because they were really training people to go into the industry. And they were real clear. They said, you're probably never going to make a film of your choice. And you know, when you're 25 or whatever, or 24, and I guess I was 24, it's just, you know, well, this isn't really going to be about self-expression. So I left, and leaving just gave me, I went back to Illinois, and then I was working on a fellowship program for a year at Penn State, but it gave me a lot of time to make photographs and refine my practice before I was accepted in graduate school. I don't know if I answered the question.
You did. That's a fantastic answer.
Oh, okay.
But I guess what I'm interested in is whether you think there's a cinematic dimension to that series.
Oh, well, there is, and I think that you know, when I look at one of the things about my work and my colleague who actually designed both our books and even my books and even my mentor is that we rarely were looking at an individual photograph. You know, our pieces all have multi-parts. I mean, we're having a big show at MoMA, San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, in January, which is the first show with the three of us is going to explore this movement together, and it's hilarious because I'm the youngster of the group and have most brain cells still operating right now, so I'm really working with it. But it's a framing nightmare because you go, oh, that's one piece by Donald Lee Phillips. Yeah, but there's 25 parts to it. And we get into a lot of interesting technical stuff with it because back in the 70s, both with her, with me, nobody had money for framing. So all of these works were printed in a way that you put a backing board, put the photo up, put glass over it, and then use these L-shaped nails around the edges. So now all of a sudden we're framing works and realize that none of us printed for them to actually have frames on them, which causes some minor issues with the margins and things. But some other things that I think, you know, were real influences on this is that Castro Street is a durational performance piece. And it's very much influenced by what was going on around me in San Francisco. San Francisco was a real stronghold at that point for performance art, and really a lot of alternative types of, I mean, we had one artist who actually created a working farm in the middle of the city under a freeway, and that was at the time that Lynn Hirschman created her persona, Roberta. I mean, so there was, I mean, the commercialism you see in the art world now didn't exist then. Nobody was doing anything to sell because nobody was selling anything. You just did it and nobody had any money, so you could kind of say what you wanted because there was no consequences to anything. So it was a really heady time. But I think that, you know, in full disclosure, the way we're presenting Castro Street here is not how it was first presented. It was actually 7 18 by 24-inch panels with text on them, and then I had printed little photographs which I tipped onto it. And this is the way I would have liked to have done it, but I did not have the means technically, nor the money to do it the way it's done here. So I think to your point, it becomes much more cinematic.
The way that it's staged now.
And it's actually much more readable too, because when you print a little image like that and you're doing nighttime images, it's tough to get what you get when you make a larger image and you open it up and you're able to get in and really work with it. And what I did do back in the day, because not only did we not have money, but places that were showing our work didn't have money. So for Castro Street, I had 2 of the hours, and I printed them as 16 by 20 inch photos, the photo above and the text below, and then we'd hang the book on the wall. So I mention all this because there's a whole other subject which we don't get into, but what happens when 40 years later you start bringing your work back and all of a sudden you're in the digital era and there's all these possibilities. And basically with my work, we've really stayed with trying to create exactly what the images looked like in the 70s when they were first printed. But with Castro Street, I really rethought it, and I'm really happy because this is only the 3rd time it's been shown since 1981, and not kind of the time I put it in my hallway after it was all framed, and so my friends could see it. But it's really interesting to see that people are really reading that piece. And so I think, as you ask a question and it takes about 10 minutes for the brain cells to sort of speed up to it. But I think 2 other influences would be Robbe-Grier's Notes for a New Novel.
Oh, okay.
And Michael Snow's Cover to Cover.
Okay. That's fascinating, because I was actually going to ask you about Arbus. There's a point in one of the captions where somebody, I think the text underneath says, somebody is sitting on the bench and looks as though Arbus could have taken a picture of them.
Yeah.
And what struck me about the final image in the series is that it looks like an Arbus photograph. But I'm sure that, I don't know, was it intentional or?
No.
No, okay. But I'm kind of interested in that as a thread through there, or the fact that Arbus is a reference point for that series.
That's a complicated question because Arbus in that whole period, just was this personage just hung there and that we all admired. My reservations didn't kick in till later about her work, but I think it's more on a superficial cultural visual level, that a photographer becomes so famous for a certain thing that becomes your reality base, and it's like you go, oh, that could be an Arbus person.
Yeah.
It's just that, and we do that with all sorts of media now.
Yeah, absolutely. When you were writing the text to go with the Castro Street pictures, to what extent were you constructing Hal Fischer? Because when I was reading it, I was obviously looking at it as documentary, but I'm interested in what extent you were aware of kind of building this persona who is telling the story.
Well, let me tell you, there were a lot of drugs in that period. So I might have to get back to you on that one. Because what I'm hoping to find as I'm getting my papers ready to go off to university is some notes on that. I think what I remember, and I have to emphasize the word think, because is that I was taking notes during the hours, but the writing, I know the writing itself really came later. And what I can't answer is, was it always my intention to be in it or not? And knowing how I write, I suspect I may have not really known what I was going to do with the writing. But what I did know is I wanted the writing and the photos to have an equivalency. And that was really important to me.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you. The second picture in the series has a really fascinating comment in it about the fact that the working class guys who are sitting on the bench are having their space and their bars taken away from them by all these horrendous gay men who are coming in. He doesn't use the word horrendous, I just interjected. But I wonder if you could say something about gentrification, because I found that a really interesting comment in that series, and it connects up with something that you say in the essay, which appears in the beautiful new book, the Gay 70s book, in which you actually do a really fantastic survey of the history of San Francisco and how it's developed over the decades. Could you say a little bit about the kind of the connection between that moment of gentrification as it occurs in the Castro Street series and your reflections on it now?
We were beginning to be aware, and the neighborhood was changing, and I don't actually even want to say that people were being displaced, because what was happening in American cities at that point was there was this flight to the suburbs. So in San Francisco, the Castro is kind of just over the hill from the Haight-Ashbury, and this was had been an working class and a little bit higher level of working class too neighborhood for Irish families, and they were just starting to move out of the city. So this housing stock was becoming available. But to your point, I think, you know, not everybody obviously left, and for the people that were staying, and for example, the older men on that bench, or the fact that this was a transit point to other neighborhoods, they were seeing this change and not really having any idea of what that actually meant. And the truth of the matter is, and I reference this in the essay, I can't remember it was 1974, but Harvey Milk started this first street fair because some of the merchants on Castro Street were so antagonistic to gay people, which is of course the irony, because it was those people moving in that actually allowed them to survive while their older clientele had moved out. And it's a very different situation than it is now, where, you know, now it's tech gentrification, and it's not people that are moving out because they want to move out. It's people that are being forced out of their homes and everything else because we don't have enough affordable housing stock. We have no place to build it, and we didn't do it for 40 years, and people are forced to leave San Francisco. So.
Yeah. One of the things that really struck me about looking at the Castro Street series is that the images and the text sometimes are telling slightly different stories from each other. And there's a lot of activity outside of the frame of the photograph that is not there, but which your words are alluding to. The activities of bodies just beyond the frame, if you like. And I guess my question is, how do you think that photography can capture cruising successfully? Because I'm aware of those pictures by Van Arvitz and Hujar as kind of capturing the movement of bodies in particular social spaces in New York. And I think your series here is a really interesting counterpoint to that.
I think photographs can capture that, and I think of what's his face, I can't remember his name, the one that Alvin that documented the piers in New York. Thank you. Yeah. I'd get it in about 20 minutes. And I think about that, you know, you can capture the visual dynamic. I suspect what happened with me is that I did not know what I was going to get when I took those photos. I know I was going to use text with them, but I needed to tell a story that was much bigger than cruising, about what that neighborhood happens over a 24-hour period, and what happened to somebody who's a young gay white male living close to that neighborhood. So, no, photographs don't tell a whole story. You know.
That's part of their magic.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you hugely for your time, Hal. That was fantastic.
Thank you.